Good morning, yogis. This is Melissa Hagedorn with the Northwest Yoga Conference, and I'm excited to join you again for another interview with a presenter from the 2018 Northwest Yoga Conference, which is coming up very soon in February 21st through the 25th. So, yay, Kevin showed up. Okay, so today we're talking with Kevin, and I just saw him pop up, so I'm going to add him into the stream. Let's see, bring Kevin on camera. Perfect. Was sending the invite to Kevin. There he is. Good morning.
Hey, glad it worked out.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry about the trouble there. I thought I had the right thing going, but apparently I didn't. But I'm here now, so.
Yeah, no, it's all good. I am pretty sure that I have yet to do a Facebook Live interview that hasn't had an issue. It's cool that this is a technology that's available, but it's not exactly turnkey yet. So, yeah, anyhow. So thanks for joining
No problem.
this morning, and I'm excited to chat with you and get to learn a little bit more about you and the Reembody method that you are teaching and sharing. And just to give a little introduction to those who are watching that are maybe not familiar with Kevin's work yet, I'm going to read this. I don't screw it up, but Kevin started out in biochemistry, which I have to say when I read that, I thought the word titration popped up in my mind. I don't have memories of that from chemistry classes, but then transitioned into being a professional actor and dancer, which
Yep.
fascinates me too. And then it became certified as a Pilates instructor in 2005 and built
hmm
upon that education and knowledge with additional training and movements methods such as Alexander technique, the Franklin method, and Tai Chi. So um,
hmm
it's a really interesting background that you bring to this. And I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that as far as just your introduction information.
Well, it's just that it definitely wasn't a direct path.
Mm-hmm.
What I thought I was going to do and what I ended up doing were pretty far from each other. And but I got to say, I feel extremely lucky to have found the career that I did because it brings me so much joy every day to do this kind of work. So I'm really pleased to be part of the community in general.
Yeah, I think that's great what you mentioned about a non-linear path, because I think that is, there used to be everyone had these careers that they did for 40 years. They stayed at the same company, and now we're living in a time where there's so much experimentation and moving from one thing to the other, and but because like for me, I went from biology background to planning a yoga event, so it's a little different. But I remember actually, I was driving in a car taking Annie Carpenter, one of the presenters, to the airport one time, and she's um, I think in her early 60s maybe, and she said, just a little piece of advice. Like I, had these little segments in my life where I thought it wasn't really planned out, but then it ends up kind of beautifully working out into this pathway that you didn't necessarily see. So it sounds like you're
And actually,
thing.
yes, and in fact, the idea of staying receptive
Mm-hmm.
to both what the environment presents and also what you are capable of
Mm-hmm.
is not only central to how Reembody got started, but also to the methodology I like to apply to human movement. That there's an environment playing out around you at all times, and then there's the things that you are capable of, and staying receptive to how those two things might change allows the brain and the body to come up with really creative solutions that you couldn't have planned for. I think that's very important with both movement methodologies and with living.
I think that's, yeah, very great advice. And something else I just noticed is a little bit unique is I think that you're standing right now. Is that true?
I
Yeah.
am, yeah.
But most people are always sitting, right? So can I just, I love that you're standing, because I'm sure it's probably related to how everyone's saying sitting is the new smoking, I think is the slogan. But that,
Well, um, I really like doing interviews and I really like public speaking and that kind of thing. But I find that I feel much more like myself when I can wiggle around and move and gesture and so on and so forth, and when I can feel my feet under me. So, I spend a lot of time sitting at my computer generating content and doing research and so on and so forth. But when it comes time to talk face to face to someone, especially a lot of someone's, I'd much rather be on my feet.
Yeah. Oh, now you have me rethinking it. Like, I should try standing for one of these. Well, I would love for you to just share. So basically, you have taken all of this knowledge that you've garnered through these different techniques that you practice and just through your experience and created your own methodology, Reembody Method. And can you share what that method is and kind of some of the basic principles behind the methodology?
Sure, sure. So, as you say, I've done a lot of not only kind of work in hard sciences, but then also explored a lot of movement methodologies. And one of the things I couldn't help but noticing was the kind of common threads that seemed to run between all of them. And what I became very interested in is pulling back from the minutia of how Tai Chi works and how Franklin method works and how chemistry works, and seeing if we can pull back just far enough to see some kind of universally consistent truths to how human brains and bodies process information.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very pleased to discover that there are some very consistent truths there. And so I based my method on these things. So rather than having to look at, say, how individual tissues behave or how to look even how individual bodies behave, I wanted to see how do the kind of immutable laws of physics that we are all subject to affect all bodies? What is common between them? And started building a method around that. And I have found that by being more general rather than specific, interventions for rehab are much faster and easier. Conditioning plateaus can be addressed much more easily, and people can be much more comfortable in their bodies. I think it's very common, especially in a rehab environment, to hear people say, "Oh, well, everybody is different, right? So you gotta tailor make these interventions and protocols person by person, and you gotta have a lot of knowledge stored up to do that." And frankly, I'm starting to think that maybe we have that pegged wrong. I think that human bodies and brains are much more similar than they are different. And by using those similarities as a basis, we can move further faster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think something that brings to mind for me is that we are kind of in a stage where we have so much information and it can be kind of overwhelming, and then you have to digest all this information and kind of try to find direction out of it, and it's just like sometimes too much. And so I think that's something I really push about the idea of the bigger picture, looking at the bigger picture, seeing the broader brushstrokes, and it simplifies things and it makes it easier for people to actually use and implement without getting confused by it or bogged down in details. And so I think that's something that's really great about the methodology that you're offering. And another thing that you touched on that I could tell kind of right away when I first was introduced to your work is, and you have this on your website, everybody, every body. So
every single.
Yeah, and so I appreciate that with the methodology as well. So I think it's great that it's so inclusive and that it can work for everybody.
In fact, as I get further into my career, one of the things I get presented with more frequently now are the really bizarre cases, right? So folks who have intractable pain that is related to, say, bizarre joint replacements, right? Joints we don't typically see replaced, like knuckles, right? Or amputations, or congenitive defects or deformities. And when these people have pain, what they are accustomed to running into when they work with physical therapists, doctors, and other health and wellness professionals is, well, because these minutia of how your body works are different from other people's, therefore certain things won't work for you, and there are certain concessions you have to make, etc. And I have been extremely excited to find that when I get presented with these very bizarre cases, the same rules still apply. That even a person who feels like they're dramatically different because of a deformity uh, at certain root levels, they're still exactly like every other body. And a lot of these consistent truths can still apply to them. And that's been really exciting because people who think they can't get help are getting help.
That's great. Yeah, I've heard. I first found you actually through my good friend Darcy, who attended one of your workshops, and she's like, "You have to have Kevin at the conference." So I started looking into your information at that point, and since then, I've heard several people who, yeah, they go to mainstream medicine looking for a solution, and there's a lot of boxes that people get put into through that, and that they were able to find some relief and healing through the Reembody method. So I think it's great work that you're offering, and I guess there's three main assessment points, or I'm not quite sure what you call them, but three main principles with the methodology. Can you share a little bit about that?
Sure. So I developed these recently because obviously for most of Reembody's existence, I've been the one guy doing Reembody things. And I got tired of that, so I decided to start doing these training modules. So now I'm training apprentices. And that forced me, of course, to have to codify the method much more than I had previously, right? It's all kind of in my head and it worked for me and I just kind of did it my way. But as I was starting to really think about, okay, how do I pass this information on to other people? Uh, I had to generate some kind of a fundamental starting point. So the three concepts that are central to um, teaching this methodology to others are, first of all, that uh, living tissue, human beings and every other living creature on Earth, is subject to the exact same immutable laws of physics that every other thing is, right? So that means that gravity, inertia, friction, air pressure, all of the external forces that act on everything also act on us. And while that sounds obvious when you say it out loud, I have been shocked to find how many physical therapy interventions, health and wellness protocols, and training mechanisms seem to ignore really basic functionality
Mm-hmm.
from physics, for other from a physics perspective. And
That
so I wanted to go.
Sorry to interrupt, but so basically they're kind of working against those principles, and how they're treating
Exactly.
is working
Exactly.
reality, basically, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And that's the way it seems to me, right? It's fine to want to look at the individual behavior of little tissues within the side of the body, but we always have to have an eye toward this little tissue exists in the exact same universe as every other piece of matter in the universe, right? So it's subject to the same rules, both chemical and physical. And if our training methods can't be traced back to those rules, then we have a problem. So that's my first thing. So uh, the second thing is that I find we also tend to lose sight of the fact that human beings are shaped the way they are for a reason. We have evolutionary specialization, just like every other animal does, right? Cheetahs and horses can run fast, and monkeys are good climbers, and turtles have flippers and can dig well, and so on and so forth. And we're comfortable making these kind of assertions when we look at other animals. But we kind of forget, we tend to think that like humans, because of our versatile lifestyle and our kind of advanced brains, we think humans should be able to do everything. And that's not strictly speaking wrong, but it must be understood within the context of evolutionary specialization. There are things that humans are evolutionarily specialized to do.
Mm-hmm.
And if we understand what those things are, then we can start placing our movements into the context the context of that specialization, which can just take a lot of pressure away and give us much more efficient ways forward. So I'll give you one example, social communication. So much about human bodies is designed for social communication. And when we understand how humans communicate socially and what naturally selected structures and mechanisms we have for that purpose, we can then use those structures and mechanisms to kind of advance our goals.
That's okay. I'm totally geeking out on I don't get to tap into like my scientist side very often, so I'm like natural selection, evolution. But I think what I'm hearing from you is that that there are things that we're specialized to do, and then there's things that we are not, and that, you know, in order, if you want to excel further in those, and taking these kind of laws of reality, of gravity, inertia, friction, and applying it to what you're doing, that's kind of the key to making maybe more progress or in whatever you're undertaking.
And understanding that it means there are trade-offs, right? And like my expectations for what my body does and how it doesn't can be more realistic. And because my expectations are realistic, it means that I can make conscious trade-offs, right? If there's let's take push-ups, right, as a really simple example. Push-ups are a perfect example of a movement that human skeletons are not really very good at. Human arms and shoulders are really not good at weight bearing. Now, they can be trained up to it, absolutely, right? And we see YouTube videos of really impressive gymnasts doing amazing things, walking on their hands and amazing tricks and bars, so on and so forth. But just think for a second about what exactly you're seeing. What you're seeing is someone who has worked extremely hard to become extremely strong at these tasks. And if you think about the tasks they're doing, they're only impressive because they're doing them with their arms. To do the same task with your legs would be really, really easy because that's what legs are made for, right? So this means that if I'm going to go into a context where I want to use my arms for weight bearing, I already can start from the idea that this is not easy, and it's not easy for a structural, evolutionary reason. So knowing that, it takes some of the pressure off, right? So I don't have to be quite so down on myself when I feel that challenge. Now, once I've gotten rid of that pressure, now I can start looking at, okay, if I understand what human arms are designed for, how can I manipulate the rules of my environment to help me get better at these weight-bearing movements with my arms? And consequently, I don't know if you've seen any of my media about push-ups, because I know push-ups are a very popular exercise, and so I post about them frequently. But my method of doing push-ups is dramatically different than most of what's out there, because I'm trying to take into specific account how these bones and tissues are shaped and how my brain responds to force entering through my palms of my hands rather than the soles of my feet. And it makes things just a whole lot easier, frankly.
So if people wanted to find information about your unique approach to push-ups, is that something that's on your blog? You have a lot of really great content on your blog, but I don't know if I saw that on there.
Yeah, so there's 3 or 4 articles that all revolve around push-ups. I think I have like 30 something articles, and 3 or 4 of them have to do with push-ups. And then quite frequently I'll get comments on the Facebook page that I'll respond to. And so yeah, if someone were to go to the blog at reembodymethod.com and go to the blog section, or even just go into a Google bar and type in Reembody push-ups, you'll find lots of resources.
Okay, so
so the third of the principles that you asked about is that all human movement is fundamentally predictable. And this is a really important one, and one that I think is, for some people, the hardest to swallow, but it's extremely freeing once we kind of buy into it. So much movement methodology is based around trying to assess, right? Someone walks in the door, and I have my little sheet, and I tick off my boxes of their degrees of range of motion and so on and so forth, and then I design a program for them. And this takes a lot of time, and when we're looking at those minutiae, the tissue minutiae, we can get so distracted with what we're seeing. But what I have found is that by looking at these universal truths from person to person, that we don't necessarily have to assess a lot of the things we think we do. Some things are predictable. For instance, once I know that someone is right-handed, right, or neurologically right-side dominant, there's a whole mess of predictions that I can now make about how that person moves that are consistent from person to person. And that fundamental predictability is an extremely valuable resource. So
you're going to be sharing these, I guess, in some capacity, these techniques at your workshops at the yoga conference. You're teaching on workshop on the pelvic floor and on the core. But for people who might be watching and might say, well, how does this apply to yoga? How do these principles because they are more general, but we're trying to apply them in a little bit of a more specific way through the practice of yoga. So can you share a little bit of insight on how you take this information and apply it to yoga, and also maybe why yoga teachers might be interested in learning this, how it might help them as they're teaching their students?
Hmm. So, so the first question first, how does this apply to yoga? One of the things that was very important to me in designing the Reembody method was wanting it to apply to everything. So I'll use an example. A right-handed person, a person who is right side dominant. I just mentioned a second ago that there are certain predictable behaviors that we can see in that person. And one of those predictable behaviors is that the center of mass of the body will tend to hug or pull in toward the dominant side. So tissues that pull the center of mass toward the dominant leg or toward the dominant arm will tend to be shorter and more neurologically stimulated than their counterparts. So knowing that, if I'm working with someone in a yoga capacity and they're telling me that they have a real tough time with their warrior one, hurts their knees, for instance, there's a really common one. One of the first things that I might look at is, in their warrior one position, is there a way that I can convince them to help have their center of mass move more into the actual center rather than staying hugged against the right side of the body or against the dominant side of the body? And I found this to be very, very easy. Like once you can kind of teach this person and show them through examples in their own body how they're doing these predictable behaviors when they don't even realize they're doing them, it becomes very easy to say, okay, what would happen if you didn't do that? What would happen if instead we allowed that center of mass to shift more over to the non-dominant foot? And then these cascading changes start taking place, and we can kind of guide those changes. So, every yoga pose is made up of the exact same bones and the exact same muscles and the exact same angles that running and walking and getting up from a chair and everything else is made of. So there doesn't have to be any difference between how you approach doing yoga and how you approach going for a run. It's the same body, it's moving the same stuff. And if we also buy in that the rules are similar, then it applies to yoga as much as it applies to everything.
Does
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's great, because I think what I've heard from attendees too who've been at your workshops before is that they kind of are learning the principles, and then they can take them and apply them to all the poses. So it's not necessarily, in this pose, these are the things you have to be thinking about. In this pose, these are the things. It's more taking these general principles and learning how to apply them across the board with the yoga practice.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, that's important to me, right? I don't want, especially when people are paying for my time, right? If they've paid to come to my workshop or they paid for a private session or something like that, I don't want to waste their money by saying, okay, let's spend 45 minutes talking about how to do downward dog, right? Let's spend 45 minutes using downward dog as an example of how your hips work, right? Or how your hips and your shoulders communicate, or how the brain interprets ground reaction forces, or whatever, right? Downward dog is an example. And then that person can take everything we did during that session, and as soon as they walk out the door, they'll feel themselves walking differently as a result. They'll feel themselves reach up and get a glass of water out of the top cupboard differently. Mm-hmm. And those differences will stack, and they'll be complementary.
And I would imagine too that knowledge then at that point that the yoga teacher or student gains, I guess if they're a yoga teacher, that they can take that and also use that as a filter when they're going around the class cueing people or making adjustments, that they can also be taking those principles in mind during that as well.
Yes. Yeah. See, we want to free up a lot of brain space for the teacher, right? Because when you're leading a room full of people, and the big teachers, like we're going to see at the conference, like Tiffany Cruikshank, she teaches classes and there's, a couple hundred people in there. And we need to free up brain space so that as she and other instructors are trying to interact with a lot of other people's nervous systems, rather than having to think of them all as these individual units and I hope that they're safe and here's a cue I'm going to give them because I think it makes them safe, but there's always that little bit of a concern, what, it doesn't quite work for this person, it doesn't work for this person. We don't have to do any of that. we can make very general rules that, and again, it's divided by side dominance basically, but very general rules that will apply to every right-handed person in the room, and other rules that will apply to every left-handed person in the room. And right off the bat, the teacher has a lot less to worry about. And that means they get to be more in their body, and it means that they get to assist people being more in their own bodies. And, that's a really beautiful gift.
And you've mentioned the right hand versus left-handed aspect, and I've heard you talk
Mhm.
about side dominance before, but is that, I guess, can you talk a little bit more about that principle and what,
Sure.
just in general, the considerations are between a left versus right-handed person? I mean, is that a main thing, one of the main things that you're looking at when?
It is. It's definitely a critical piece of information. And in fact, in my apprentice trainings, I mean, the bulk of the first 20 hours of apprentice training
Mhm.
are about understanding why humans evolved side dominance in the first place, or why actually not just humans have side dominance. Most every animal does, um, but why is side dominance evolved in the first place? What is it for? What are the evolutionary benefits we get by being side dominant? And then practically, how do we apply that knowledge to people in motion? That's a really big starting point for people.
Mhm.
Um, and and so to kind of the quick synopsis I can give you here is that essentially the dominant side of the body is better at what I call expressing energy into the environment, right? So if I need to take uh, elastic energy stored in the tissues of my body, and I need that energy to go to affect the environment somehow, to push, pull, break, grab, lift, etc. The dominant side of the body is more specialized for those tasks, expressing energy out from the body into the environment. The non-dominant side of the body is the opposite. It's more organized at bringing energy from the outside environment into the body, right? So managing impact forces, managing things like friction, more of these kind of stabilizing functions where we interact with the environment and let that force in. And so there are a lot of local organizations throughout the body, local joint organization that contribute to that broader specialization term. So we can say, I can very comfortably say about someone's dominant side that certain joints are rotating in certain directions or are tense in certain directions purely because of that neurological specialization. And what's interesting is that, and this is very common that people get confused about this, side dominance, or what's called laterality. Laterality is not the same as proficiency, right? So just because you write with your right hand does not necessarily mean that you are neurologically right side dominant.
Mhm.
Now, most people are, right? Most people who are right side dominant write with their right hand. But I have worked with plenty of people for whom their proficiency and their neurological dominance don't necessarily match. And so I have also designed my own set of tests to affirm what exactly is your neurologically dominant side.
Interesting. So, do you have any ideas as to why, for those people that are proficient on one side but dominant on the other side, is that just like in their childhood somehow they ended up on the path of being right-handed even though they're proficient on the or dominant on the left? Or
Yeah, actually, it gets really interesting. Uh, as I was saying a second ago, humans are primarily, well, one of our chief evolutionary guides has been social communication, right? We're an obsessively social species. And the the information we get from other humans, in particular from our parents when we're children or from our caretakers when we're children, has an extremely strong influence about how our bodies organize. Um, and so even if I'm neurologically, say, left side dominant, but I'm living in a right side dominant environment, especially if that environment is, um, let's be kind and call it not optimal, right? If it's hyper stressful or traumatic, I might adopt right side dominant behaviors in order to fit in better, in order to avoid conflict, all different kinds of things. So again, this goes back to why I mentioned social communication first, because humans can update their physiology based on social information quite rapidly and often do.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah,
So much that we're learning about brains and I guess that would be fall under the category of neuroplasticity. Would you say?
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. And mammals in general are extremely neuroplastic. And one of the things that we can say about human brains compared to other mammal brains is it seems that we're hyper specialized for that plasticity and neuroplasticity so that we can generate culture. And that culture allows us to then bond with certain members of our species really, really, really intensely, which is something that humans do have a specialized gift for.
Yeah. I'm gonna have to get your reading list after this interview. um, and if you
Yeah,
share,
my apprentices, for my apprentice trainings, we have a reading list that is, I mean, it's not huge, but the items are important.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Neuroplasticity is a really fascinating thing right now, and just a lot of the stuff that we're discovering about it. And
Hmm.
well, one other thing I wanted to ask you about while we have you on here is, one of the issues I think a lot of people have today, especially because we're sitting so much, and because we're sitting so much with a lot of people like this with their phone in front of their face. Every time I go out, my husband and I are like, and there's everyone sitting at the table just with their phones. Not us. We're looking at everybody else who's doing it because we try to not do that. We still do it sometimes, but we really try not to. Anyhow, so it's really affecting posture significantly. And I was reading something recently. I should have looked to see what it was called. There's a condition, I guess, that especially in like older women where they kind of get that hump back thing going on their.
The dowager's hump.
Yes, thank you. So do you have any tips or tricks or things that people can keep in mind to help improve their posture? I mean, obviously the simplest thing is probably not to use a smartphone, but that's probably not going to happen. So taking that into consideration.
Well, actually, my advice here might surprise you, and surprise a lot of people. In that, um, okay, let's start with this. What we call posture, right, is simply the brain trying to organize the body so that it interacts with the environment in the safest, most efficient possible way. And the brain puts an extremely high priority on that idea of short-term safety, right? So it wants desperately to protect you into the next moment in time, right? And as each moment in time happens, it's constantly thinking of ways to protect you and trying to balance a lot of the dangers it sees incoming. So the way that our body is organized and the way that our postures look are always expressions of what our brain thinks is safe right now. So if we want to change our posture, or if we for some reason think our posture needs changing, the first question we have to ask is, what is the threat that my brain thinks it's protecting me from? You follow me there? Right? Because I can't just, what was that?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can't, if I just go in and start trying to change things in the body willy-nilly,
Yeah.
without understanding why that brain organized that body that way in the first place, then I have no reason to believe that as soon as I'm done making all my changes, the brain's not going to change it right back to where it was. Right? So the nervous system.
For the people who maybe are developing poor posture or the hump or something, that it is their body's way of responding to whatever they're doing, and it thinking that it's keeping them safe. It's functioning in some way. Okay.
Exactly. And this is a totally different, a big shift in perspective, right? Poor posture, as we're used to thinking of it, I much prefer to think of it as this is the best the brain knows how to do with what's happening right now. And that brain is keeping you safe, right? That dowager's hump and those bow legs and that kyphosis, these things are methods of keeping you safe from something worse. Now, it's not that those things can't be improved.
Yeah.
What was that?
I was going to say that I think that actually makes a lot of sense when you explain it that way from an evolutionary standpoint. Hmm.
Yeah. Yes. And so it's not that those things can't be improved. It's just that I need to start working with the brain's perception of threat in order to make that improvement. And it can't come from a place of, oh, look at that terrible posture, you better straighten up. That's not going to work, because then we just create an argument where the brain is saying, well, I have to do this because I think it's safe, but now you're telling me I have to do this because it's shameful. And the argument between safe and shameful is not one that ever helped anyone. So what I start with is, why does your brain think that dropping the skull into a forward position is safer? And again, as it turns out, there's a lot of really consistent patterns at work there, and it's a really sensible decision under certain circumstances. So what I typically come in and do is try to provide an environment where we take away the perceived threat. So looking at the person or looking at the class and trying to immediately address the things that their nervous system, either consciously or unconsciously, thinks are threatening. And then we start playing with, okay, let's say, so if these threats are gone, how could we move in an environment where there isn't that threat? And what I find frequently is a lot of time the answer just presents itself. I don't necessarily have to do much. All I have to do is make a space where there's no threat. And then the brain knows exactly what to do. But if it doesn't, I can always kind of feed some of the answers as needed. Mm-hmm. So one of the big ones, to get to a more specific answer to your question, is that part of all the sitting that we do means that our brain doesn't really know what to do with the force that comes in through the soles of our feet, right? So because, are you familiar with the term proprioception?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so proprioception, how the brain maps our position in space, right? So if I were a hunter-gatherer from 20,000 years ago and I was walking or running or moving around for 80% of my day in a very relaxed way, the constant interaction of the soles of my feet with the ground give me a really robust proprioception, so that no matter what kind of forces I run into, the brain knows exactly what to do to upload those forces safely. But for a modern human who maybe only takes, who, again, really active humans only take 10,000 steps a day, that's not enough to be able to generate the kind of proprioceptive map that we need to manage the kind of forces that gravity is throwing at us, which are huge. So the position we often adopt to protect us from that is, and I'll see if I can demonstrate it here. I'm going to tip my camera angle down a little. You still see me okay?
Yes. Yeah, that's great.
Okay. So what we often do is this. So this is me. I'm taking my xiphoid process, that little pokey bit between the ribs, mm-hmm. and I'm shoving it forward. And you can't see my knees, but I've also kind of locked my knees backwards. Now, the irony of this position is that if you walk into most rooms with your chest out and your chin in, people will commend you for having good posture. But the fact is, if this is my natural posture of being supported, if I do this, you can start to see how there's compensation happening all through my spine. And again, it makes my shoulders look broad and it makes me look very upright, but this is not necessarily biomechanically better. And so this happens because as the brain loses its ability to map, one second here, as the brain loses its ability to map the forces coming in through the legs, it has to create a break somewhere so that those forces don't damage the joints up in the top. And so that little extension behind the xiphoid process, what we call the thoracolumbar junction, that extension at that point kind of breaks the chain. And it means the upper body is now operating independently, force-wise, of the lower body. Now, that's absolutely safer if you have no proprioceptive map for your legs and for your feet. Mm-hmm. See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So what we need to do is change that proprioceptive map and then watch the body just naturally settle back into letting the legs support you.
So you can basically help your body build the proprioception that you need to create at least what we feels like better posture in the body.
Absolutely. And in fact, what I've been very pleased to discover is that it's also quite rapid. if my litmus test for if I come across a movement or an exercise that I think should be part of the Reembody method, one of the ways I test that is after one repetition, things should change.
Mm-hmm.
Because the nervous system knows when it's safer or not safer. And
Mm-hmm.
if I do a movement and and I do one repetition of this movement or of this manipulation, and then I say, okay, stand up, and it makes absolutely no change in the body, then it's probably not right. But
Mm-hmm.
if I make this manipulation and the person stands up and says, whoa, that's weird, now I know I'm onto something. Because if we're working with the brain and working with the brain's perception of threat, physical tissue can change immediately. It doesn't take a lot, right? If someone tells me that you have to do an exercise 12 times a day, 3 days a week for a year in order to make a change, that's not going to work.
Yeah, well, I think people probably appreciate having simpler solutions to things in that way. So, one thing that you touched on too that I thought was interesting is you mentioned about, not feeling shameful because your body is responding in a certain way. And that's actually something that I see as a really strong theme as well on your social media. And I really actually enjoy following your social media accounts because there's a lot of those kind of trite expressions that come out through the community, and you kind of take them and draw lines through them and write new words in and kind of redefine things in a way that I really appreciate and I think is sending really positive messages out there. So that's something I really appreciate about that as well, that that people don't need to feel shamed about those things. It's just their body responding in a natural way, and then they can learn and adjust accordingly. And so that's something I really appreciated.
Yeah, I as a culture, we tend to get pretty down on ourselves physically. I feel comfortable saying that most people think of their bodies as something that needs to be improved,
Mm-hmm.
and um, that's a bit heartbreaking. And one of the things that in my line of work, I have been kind of very fortunate to realize is the degree to which at any given moment your body is doing a number of amazing things that you couldn't possibly begin to comprehend, right? The very fact that you can get up and walk around at all uh, relies on so many mechanisms that are so specialized and so improbable that it's kind of a miracle all by itself. And it's a wonderful thing to think of your own body as a miracle, and uh, everybody's allowed to do that. It doesn't matter what your posture looks like. It doesn't matter how much you weigh. It doesn't matter what color your skin is or how long your hair is or what kind of defects or deformities you were born with or whatever. Like everybody who's up and who's living is living as a result of absolutely incredible mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a great place to start the process of being in your body, of being in a body that you're free to love. You don't have to not love it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think we take for granted sometimes just, yeah, how many processes are going on in our body at one time. And, I'll have moments where I have a moment of awareness about that. Like, it's a miracle that I can even do this. Like you said, walking, going for a run, doing yoga. I mean, anything really. It is a miracle. Our bodies are pretty amazing. So I think that is a great little nugget of wisdom for people to remember. And even just, even first thing when they wake up every morning, just having that acknowledgement that it's just an amazing thing, even just that their body's able to be there for them to function and to go through. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Something else I just, because I run a business, so I always get curious about businessy type things too. But you mentioned earlier that you just actually over the process, I think of this last year, have taken the methodology that you developed and you've turned it into, I guess, training courses to help train other people to be able to teach this methodology or implement it into what they're already offering. And I'm just curious if you could share a little bit about what that experience was like for you, taking the stuff that you've developed and turning into training courses, and just, yeah, from the entrepreneurial side of things, what that was like.
Um, the coolest job I can possibly imagine is what that's like. Yeah, I have had, it has been such an amazing journey
Mm-hmm.
going from something that was just inside of my own head to now something that I have almost 40 apprentices now, and they're all doing really good work. And the kind of trust fall that went into that first one, that first RCA training, uh, um, thinking, okay, I'm about to pull back the curtain and let these people inside and say things out loud that have only ever been inside my own head. Is it going to work? Are they going to accept it? Is it teachable? And to be overwhelmingly positive in the response was just a real amazing experience. Real amazing experience. And the second one that we've done two of these now, and we've got three more on the calendar. But the second one was even better, because once I knew I could engage in that trust fall, it became even easier to kind of put it all out there. Uh, the hardest part, for sure, was designing the materials, because a lot of the Reembody method has to do with essentially utilizing the parts of the brain that rely on intuition, right? Because intuition, the way I like to say it is, if you ask Randy Johnson, the baseball pitcher, to throw a fastball for you, he'll throw an amazing one. He's done it thousands of times, right? He's really good at that. But if you ask him to go ahead and write down all of the physics equations associated with fluid dynamics that go into how he throws a fastball, he has no idea, right? If you ask him to think about throwing a fastball, he'll throw a poor fastball. But as soon as you just let him throw one, clearly there is part of his brain that he's not conscious of that is very good at calculating things like fluid dynamics and spatial relationships and so on and so forth. And what we call intuition is, in fact, simply allowing those parts of the brain to do the things that they're good at. Mm-hmm. But that happens mostly on the surface. So taking that knowledge and then trying to design materials, that made with words and pictures, mm-hmm. That kind of indicate that intuition was a challenge. And I can safely say that the materials that one gets as an RCA apprentice look very different than the kind of materials you get from, say, like an NASM training or an EBFA training. It's about tapping into that part of the brain that allows you to sense things with a lot of accuracy that you do not have conscious control over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you're doing another training soon with that. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. So we've got the next one is in Switzerland, in Zurich, Switzerland, and that's going to be a standard RCA 20, and that's April 7th through the 10th, and there's still some slots available for that. And then we're doing two in Calgary, in Canada, and one of them is going to be in June. June of 2018, and then the next one's going to be in January of 2019.
And are those a 3-day format or 2-day or how?
4 days. So it's 4 days, 5 hours each day.
Okay. And then you'll be joining us here in February for the Northwest Conference, and you're doing a workshop on the pelvic floor and another one on the core. Can you just touch briefly on what attendees might expect out of those workshops, why they would be interested in attending those?
Sure. So the pelvic floor workshop is the one I'm most excited about. We only added that one recently, and it was a lot of back and forth between myself and my business manager about whether or not we should add that to our repertoire, because I have a lot of really great tools for dealing with pelvic floor dysfunction, but it's such a sensitive topic, and I wasn't sure that I wanted to put that out there at this stage of the game. But I'm so glad that we did, because we've done the pelvic floor workshop, I want to say 3 or 4 times now, and each time it's been one of our most successful in terms of kind of seeing people get help that they couldn't get elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and so I'm really excited to bring that to a larger audience. And I noticed that we've got a lot of people in that workshop at the conference. And so I'm really excited. It'll be the biggest audience I've shared that workshop with.
Oh, that's
But it will address essentially pelvic floor dysfunction, both in women and men, that leads to things that are, I think really troubling for people, like stress incontinence, and general instability. And so we're going to be giving some very practical tools that do not simply boil down to do more Kegels, right? We're going to do something a lot smarter and a lot more robust, a lot more intuitive that like we talked about before, people can transfer into other movements they're doing. And the core workshop is actually, I'm going to admit to you right now, it's a little bit of a bait and switch. I'm a little sneaky with the core workshop, and here's why. I really don't like that term, core. I think it's a misleading term, and I think it's one of those that it's high time for that to be phased out, because the old wisdom has said that more, not even strength, more tension in the abdominal wall has a positive impact on things like injury rates and performance. And while the data suggests some things like that, I think our analysis of why that works is not exactly correct. So what we're going to do in the core workshop is look at what is the abdominal wall evolved to do? How does it fit into our evolutionary pattern? And how can we look at movements that utilize the abdominal wall at its most efficient without having to just squeeze it randomly when we do exercises, right? So we're gonna do a lot of very sophisticated movements in there with the expectation that people will learn at the end. It's really not just the core. The core is a connection point. It's a adapter between the upper and lower body, and how we make that adaptation work is how we get good core function.
Oh, that's great. Those both sound like really dense with information, but in a manageable way. And definitely the pelvic floor, I think a lot of people have issues with that. So I think that's probably one of the reasons it's been a very popular workshop at the conference. And yeah, definitely excited to have the opportunity to study with you in person, and honored that you're coming up to join us at a yoga conference to share your knowledge with our attendees.
I had such a great time last year. The Pain for Yoga workshop I think was probably the most fun. It was the most enjoyable workshop I did that year. Was the Pain for Yoga at the conference. So I'm really excited to be back. I'm very honored that you invited me back.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and so just in wrapping this up, are there resources that you can point people to find more information about you online? And I mentioned earlier you have a blog which has a lot of really great information and resources on there, but if you share some locations where people can find out more, that would be great.
Sure, yeah. So we actually just launched a new version of our website not like a month and a half ago. So reembodymethod.com is a brand new site from what we've had over the years, and it's much more robust, a lot more information. People can access our products much more easily, like signing up for events, signing up for private sessions. I do online sessions, so kind of like you and I are video chatting right now. I work with people online like this. It's been a really successful format. So all those things can be done from the website, and then of course the blog. Our Facebook page also has a lot of content on it. So Facebook/Reembody Method. And as a matter of fact, the Facebook page has some stuff on it that the website doesn't, because we're kind of much more rapidly adding little clips and answering questions and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of cool information there. And the last thing I'll mention is that for those interested in potentially becoming a Reembody apprentice, we have a separate closed Facebook page that's for apprentices only. And it's got, as of right now, like 40 hours of video. And the group is really, really active with submitting questions, and we do twice weekly office hours, and all those things are posted in an archive for people to use. So the trainings that we offer are not just about the training. There's ongoing support that's really, really robust and really information rich.
That's great. And I think, yeah, definitely if people are interested, come to the conference and get to connect with you and learn more, and then hopefully plant that seed, but travel to Switzerland or Calgary. Hopefully you'll have another one in the Pacific Northwest in the near future too.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, of the three I mentioned, I'm quite certain there will be more. We'll be adding more to the calendar as we go. But yeah, so we'll just kind of see what happens.
Yeah, well, that's great. Thank you so much for making the time today to chat and share your real intimate knowledge on this topic, and really just a lot of great information that you shared. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate your kind of fresh new perspective on the movement world. So thanks for sharing that with us.
It's my pleasure.
Uh,
Thanks, Melissa.
Thanks everyone for tuning in. Have a good day.